It's seen as a golden opportunity for hackers and cyber criminals. The personal data of more than 500 million Facebook users shared online. So, who's responsible for the security breach? And how can users be protected? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. It may seem safe enough to post your phone number and date of birth on social media, but that information could end up being shared all over the web. That's what happened to more than 500 million Facebook users. Their personal details were posted online on a website for hackers. According to the Business Insider publication, the security breach affects people from 106 countries, including the US, UK, and India. Cybersecurity experts are worried the accounts are subject to identity theft and could be used for fraud and cybercrimes. Facebook says the data was collected in 2019. It's not the first time Facebook has been breached and users' data exposed online. A technical glitch in 2008 revealed confidential birth dates of 80 million Facebook users. In 2013, a software flaw exposed phone numbers and email addresses of 6 million users. In 2018, profile details from 87 million users were improperly accessed by political data firm Cambridge Analytica. Facebook's messaging platform WhatsApp had a security breach in 2019 that allowed hackers to install spyware on phones via the app's phone call function. And last year, its social media accounts were temporarily taken over by a group of hackers who said it was an attempt to show cyber vulnerabilities. Let's have a look at how big a problem the hacking business is. A Clark School study at the University of Maryland says there's a hacker attack every 39 seconds. Identity theft has spiked during the coronavirus pandemic, with 1.4 million reports of such incidents in the U.S. alone last year. Google has registered more than 2 million phishing sites as of January 17th this year. It's estimated by 2025, cybercrime will cost the world more than $10 trillion a year. And by 2027, it's forecast the cybersecurity market will be worth more than $400 billion. All right, let's bring in our guests. In Washington, D.C., Jody Westby is Chief Executive at Global Cyber Risk Technology and Advisory Services firm. Joining us from Maastricht, Catalina Goanta, Assistant Professor in Private Law at Maastricht University and co-manager of Maastricht Law and Tech Lab. And in Berlin, Caroline Sinders, visiting researcher at Weizenbaum Institut and fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. Jody, let me start with you today. Facebook has said in a statement that this is old data that was previously reported on in 2019. They also said that they had found and fixed this issue in August of 2019. But whether or not this issue was fixed by Facebook, the user data is still out there, right?
Well, it's not only out there, a lot of it is valid. Birth dates are valid no matter how old they are. Some of the personal particulars that were included in this data, emails and phone numbers and birth dates and other personal affiliations, that is still valid data. Certainly birth dates are, and emails and cell phone numbers especially are very valuable. So for them to just dismiss this as, oh, it's old data, we fixed this 2 years ago, just completely shows disrespect for all those 500 million users whose personal identification is now out there.
Catalina, what's the liability of companies like Facebook and other tech giants when it comes to their cybersecurity standards? And when are data breaches and hacks a sign of negligence?
That's a great question. So from a data protection perspective, also according to the GDPR, companies first and foremost are going to have an obligation to notify not only the data protection authorities, but also the users when they identify that there has been a very considerable harm brought to the users because of these data breaches. For instance, in the Netherlands, the fine of not notifying the data protection authority can go up to 850,000 euros. That is something that is at least straightforward. On the other hand, what you were asking about standards that are applicable from the perspective of cybersecurity, that's a little bit less clear, because from a legal perspective, we need to look into contractual liability, into tort liability, and that is really going to depend on the jurisdiction. And perhaps what we could say is that if there is going to be a harm brought to a vulnerable user because they're going to get scammed due to the fact that, as Jody mentioned, their email address and their phone number is out there on the internet, perhaps there can be a tort liability because of this situation, or, as I said, a contractual liability.
Caroline, how does this incident differ from other incidents in the past, and how significant is it that this data is now on a hacking website? How much more accessible is it?
I would say it's extremely accessible. As Troy Hunt, who runs Have You Been Pwned, which is a great website for people to check if their passwords or emails have been are a part of a data breach. He noted on Twitter that the data set of this personal information has been shared many times, and it's been now replicated on different websites. So at this point, it's really out in the public. If one website is taken down, the data set itself is now replicated and stored other places. So what it is it's now a large data set in access of people's personal information that really many people can access and use for a variety of nefarious ways. I guess in terms of how it differs, a lot of it is the size, for example, and we have to ask about the steps Facebook has taken to notify the users, and also the amount and the different kinds of data that's been shared. So it's not just phone numbers; it is things like email, it's things like potentially people's addresses, their real names, etc. So it's a lot of data. It's not just, for example, a password or an email address, but a lot more personal, and as Jody has said, valid information about an individual.
Catalina, I saw you nodding to a lot of what Caroline was saying just there. Let me ask you to expand on some of what she was saying. First of all, let me see if you have a reaction to what she was saying. But secondly, I want to ask you, what do we know as far as what Facebook has done, what steps they've taken to notify people whose data has been breached?
So I was just in agreement with everything that Caroline mentioned, because the thing is that, as you were also saying earlier, Facebook says this is all data, so this is why we're not going to take any kind of measures. But I think what we need to do is take a step back and ask ourselves, indeed, is this data actually the result of the exploitation of a security vulnerability? Or is it even worse than that? Because at least when we're speaking about a vulnerability, that it can be a very sophisticated, and maybe Jody has more information about that. But if this is a very sophisticated cybersecurity standard, that's one thing. But Facebook has been using its Graph API to give access to a lot of third parties, a lot of developers, to the type of data that Caroline was mentioning. So it is also very likely that this type of data set is just an aggregated data set based on web scraping and also based on the use of the Graph API. And that's where the liability for Facebook could be even multiplied, because it happened that in 2018, I believe, the Information Commissioner's Officer from the United Kingdom actually fined Facebook £500,000 because of the data sharing practices that led to the Cambridge Analytica incident. And so did the Italian Competition Authority on a different ground, on the ground that Facebook has been misleading its consumers with respect to the kind of data sharing standards that it's actually disclosing to the consumers. So it's saying one thing, but it's doing a completely different thing.
Jody, it seems like every few months we hear about another big hack or data breach, whether we're talking about users of social media platforms and their information, or whether we're talking about cyber warfare that are affecting entire countries and governments. From your perspective, are people paying enough attention? Are people alarmed by what's going on, or as alarmed as they should be?
It's interesting. I think people are alarmed. I'd like to step back just a second, though, to the thread that you were just on, because we have to remember that Facebook is under an order from our Federal Trade Commission, who fined Facebook $5 billion for the Cambridge Analytica problems and breaching its consent order. And so it is under an order to have security, a full security program. And so it it does have a legal obligation, and they were notified, I think, in January that their birth dates were able to be seen on users. And so when we go forward and look at this, we can say, well, they had noticed, yes, mistakes can happen. There isn't a silver bullet for security, but they are notorious for not having good privacy, for not having good governance practices, and for violating their own requirements under the FTC consent order. So I think all of that has to be considered.
Caroline, how much are hackers changing their techniques as cybersecurity advances, and how easy a target are social media sites and feeds?
Well, I'm not really sure if I'm the best person to necessarily answer that. But one thing I will say is, hackers are often looking for any and all kinds of vulnerabilities, be it, white hat hackers or black hat ones, with the creation of bug bounties, trying to actually find vulnerabilities in terms to fix them. That's pretty normal. But I think it's important to remember and actually point out the amount of personal data that social media platforms collect on people, and then the amount of data they actually request. So for example, with Facebook was repeatedly requesting people's phone numbers in terms of things like two-factor authentication. So another way for a user to try to add a little more security to their account. And then, as Vice had pointed out, those phone numbers ended up being used for targeted ads. So I think it's incredibly important to point out that there's a lot of information people place into social media and then are also given in terms to verify their accounts, etc. And that kind of personal information are things when leaked, again, as Jody has pointed out, calling it valid information. It's information that once leaked is incredibly difficult for a user to change or augment. It's slightly easier to change a password, but how do you change your birth date, for example, or your social security number, or your address, or your phone number? Those things are much more stickier and harder and personal. People actually need that kinds of information to function, right, in any different society or a city that they're existing in. So, we have to also look at how platforms and general big tech companies are requesting information, how they're storing it, why they're requesting it, and also what they're using it for. And Facebook is, we can point out many different examples of Facebook misusing the data that they access even on their own.
Catalina, are breaches of this magnitude being reported to data protection authorities? And which of the data protection authorities are the ones that would take measures to try and ensure that this doesn't happen again?
So when it comes to data protection authorities, in principle, if you look at also the data that was reported to have been leaked in the past days, you can see that there's a plethora of countries and jurisdictions that have victims or that have users on their territories who have been affected by this leak. Now, in principle, Facebook should be reporting this type of situation to all of these data protection authorities wherever they exist. However, the problem is also that these authorities are very often completely overburdened with the type of harms that happen on digital markets. And although there is a legal framework for the reporting and there is a legal framework for even the cooperation between different data protection authorities, so for instance, the GDPR even has a full chapter on that, how different national data protection authorities can cooperate and can exchange information so that they can have joint investigations. At the end of the day, it just boils down to the kind of resources that these agencies have. And this is what happens in practice, is that a lot of these data protection authorities simply are not going to take that many measures depending on the jurisdiction. And this leaves citizens and consumers completely vulnerable. And this is why I would like to also mention that citizens can even take another type of path to protect themselves, and that is collective actions. And we're going to see more of that in the European Union as of 2023, when a new directive is going to come into force.
Jody, what do you think? Will there be more collective actions taken in the U.S.?
Oh, yes, there'll be a class action lawsuit filed. And depending on whether this has an impact on Facebook, they already have had shareholder derivative suits filed against their board and securities class action suits. And so it'll be interesting to see whether another round based on this incident gets started. But the plaintiff's bar is definitely awake and very alert to these types of incidents.
Caroline, is Facebook and our other media companies doing enough to allay the fears of users right now?
I would say probably not. If Facebook's reaction to, for example, this leak in particular is to say that this information is old and not necessarily highlight or take ownership over how much data has been leaked, then no, that's not enough, right? We see a variety of different kinds of harms coming out of platforms from, how network violence and harassment tends to proliferate on platforms, from spaces where we see conspiracy theories sort of launching and coming into major trends and campaigns. And then in this case, too, where we see like major data breaches with kind of either a hand waving as a term of reaction, or, not necessarily pointing out or taking the steps of how this happened and how it could be fixed. So my response would be no, not enough.
Catalina, let me ask you something that I asked Jody earlier as well. I mean, from your vantage point, do you think that, people are as alarmed as they should be when it comes to these breaches, or have they become accustomed to hearing about them? Are they worried about, the cyber warfare that's been going on that's affecting, countries around the world and governments around the world as well?
I believe that consumers do not know and do not realize nearly as much as they ought to when it comes to the kind of harms that they open themselves to when they do decide, because this is also a matter of personal decision making, to share a lot of information with Facebook. So I'm not even speaking about the information that Caroline was mentioning, the fact that Facebook would ask for instance, the phone number for one purpose and then maybe misuse it. But a lot of users also have the naivete of thinking that any kind of information, any kind of personal data that they share is going to be safe on Facebook. However, what we see is that, especially for consumers, there's going to be a massive vulnerability in terms of the type of social engineering that can be done on the basis of these types of data sets bought or shared on the dark web or on hacker forums. Because a lot of elderly populations especially are going to fall prey to the type of phone calls that will use some of these data points to gain the trust of that particular user and then basically deplete, let's say, the savings of an 8-year-old. And this type of activity is now so incredibly popular, criminally speaking, that even YouTubers are now launching YouTube channels and Twitch channels where they actually play the elderly and then they try to play with the social scammers. So it's a tremendous risk, and I think that we really need to do more as a society also to just educate our population on these kind of harms.
Jody, I saw you nodding along to some of what Catalina was saying. Did you want to jump in?
Well, just that I fully agree. I don't think that people are as aware as to all the exploits that can be performed using your personal information. The list has grown significantly. It's not just identity theft anymore. And so I think people are somewhat, have become somewhat immune to hearing about this, but then they realize that the harm is out there because it's the person that ultimately has to unravel the damage to their life. But it's also that we don't have enough action by government officials to really come down and hammer companies on this, because this just keeps happening. And companies just simply aren't spending the money they need to spend to put in the right kinds of security programs. So I think it's a lot of things. It's the consumers who don't really understand the environment. It's everyone kind of going, oh, another one of those events. And then also the government's just not being as strict and enforcing everything they possibly can after these incidents occur.
Caroline, I also saw you reacting to some of what Jody was saying right now. Did you want to add to that?
Sure. To give an example of how I think consumers either aren't aware or maybe it doesn't enter their periphery enough. And some of the online harassment research work I do, one of the things we've been looking at is how do you how do you encourage people to take preventative steps towards harassment? And that's very linked to security, for example, of having more security or privacy protocols, of switching up one's passwords frequently, of doing things like two-factor authentication, of regularly removing their data from the internet by using things like Delete Me. And really, you can tell people a series of steps to engage in, but it doesn't actually really seem to register with users that that's something to do until they face harm, until they have to respond to a harm that they've faced to then engage in those actions. So I think it's a very similar thing when we talk about these data breaches of until someone faces perhaps more direct harm from the data breach, do they realize how it's linked to their information being put out there? And that is a problem when we're trying to create things like preventative education, for example. If the only response is once you face the harm, you understand the level of it.
Catalina, from your perspective, what are the steps, what are the concrete steps that could be taken, to really help with this kind of situation, to really educate people, to try to make sure this doesn't happen again?
I think so. From an institutional perspective, just to echo what Jody was saying, I think that it would be very important for consumer protection authorities, data protection authorities, even competition authorities to launch themselves into more public campaigns, just awareness campaigns to reach all of these users and to perhaps really push the message that indeed it is very important to be more hygienic when it comes to internet use. And this is a problem right now that you see that all of these institutions are not only underfunded when it comes to, or relatively to the nature and the scope of harm that we see on digital markets, but they also remain quite essentially national. So we have in the European Union now the GDPR, and as I was mentioning, we have these coordination and cooperation frameworks, but the problem is that these harms are international, they are transnational, yet everything that we do just remains national. And I think that that's just something that we need to tackle and we need to figure out how to deal with in the future.
I mean, Jody, if we can take a step back for a moment and look at a theme that keeps coming up in our discussion today. I mean, this all really shows that the lifespan of a breach or a hack, it really just goes on and on, doesn't it?
It does. And, it really highlights the need for cyber due diligence in mergers and acquisitions, because when you buy a company, you buy all of its previous breaches, you buy all of its vulnerabilities. And that is something many of us have talked about, but it also just highlights the need for companies to just in general understand that just because something happened a year or two ago doesn't mean that problem is over. Like Facebook seems to think, oh, that's just old news, that's old data. And we also have to remember, too, that intelligence agencies from all over the world are going to be all over this data, because this gives them a lot of very useful data about a high volume of users in countries around the world. And so there's another reason the US government should be all over Facebook and saying, get this information secure, and we can't have this kind of data leakage. It's just a very complex problem that has so many different quills, if you will, that can reach out and impact people and governments and society, that it's very problematic, and it highlights the need for cybersecurity to be taken more seriously by everybody, individuals, companies, and the government.
Catalina, the new privacy laws that have come into existence in parts of Europe and parts of the United States, how much of an impact are they going to have on social media companies going forward?
So what we've seen is that the GDPR, for instance, has been really touted as a gold standard in privacy. But there have also been some opinions according to which the FTC actually has been really trying to enforce the national, or let's say federal standards of privacy in the U.S. in a much more but let's say impactful way than the data protection authorities have done in the European Union. So on the one hand, it's an interesting development also from a legal perspective, but on the other hand, it's also short of what we still need. And to also just build on what was mentioned before, I think that perhaps some stringent rules on cybersecurity, and also the idea of, okay, what are the standards, what are the official legal standards that a social media company ought to fulfill still from a security perspective, not some ISO, standardization approaches that just signal industry compliance, but actual legal standards that can hold these companies accountable for the fact that they are downplaying the role of cybersecurity in their operations. There's a book by Bruce Schneier, which I absolutely love. It's called Click Here to Kill Everybody. And I think it's really a great metaphor for what's happening right now. People are, and especially companies, are getting very ignorant when it comes to their operations and the cybersecurity standards they need to comply with.
All right, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thank you so much to all of our guests, Jody Westby, Catalina Goanta, and Caroline Sinders. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.